I'd like to pivot to our first session then of the morning, the first panel. And so I'd like to welcome up on stage Anjana Rajan, who's the Assistant National Cyber Director in the Office of National Cyber Director, and Jack Cable, who's a Senior Advisor with CISA, to join me up on stage. And we're going to talk a little bit about, so this might seem like a left field kind of way to start a technology conference, a technology panel, but so much of what we do is in this kind of highly regulated space around security, where increasingly governments are interested in not just like where are the problems, but what are the right policies to adopt to try to address those challenges. So give me a chance to just find the right place in my notes here. So thank you both for traveling such a long distance to attend the event and to help us know more about this work. Anjana, I'd like to start with you. Could you tell us more about the work of the Office of National Cyber Director, specifically in the domain of open source software?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be here with you again, Brian, and being here in Canada as a proud Canadian myself. So as you mentioned, I work for the Office of the National Cyber Director at the White House. And if you've never heard of us, it's okay. It's because we're actually a new office in the White House. We were established just in 2021, and our mandate is to serve as the principal advisor on cybersecurity policy and strategy to the president. And what we're best known for is writing the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which the president signed on March 2nd, so fairly recently. One of the things that we say a lot at ONCD is that a secure and resilient cyberspace is not just a national security imperative, but it's also an economic prosperity imperative and a democracy and human rights imperative. And to me, nothing illustrates that any better, that nexus better than the open source software ecosystem. I think it's, in many governments, I think in the wake of Log4Shell, had a very, were reacted to that vulnerability with a lot of fear. And I think for us, we're slightly different because we want to take a more optimistic and nuanced approach. Because for us, we understand that open source software is mission critical to our national interests, and making sure that it's thriving is not only important for us, again, on the developer side, but for all of our collective goals. And so one of the things that we've established in the Biden administration is something called the Open Source Software Security Initiative, also known as OS3I, which is really an interagency effort that both Jack and I are part of to really think about what are the policy solutions for this ecosystem. And there are many familiar faces here in the audience that have been part of that with us, including you, Brian, to really think about what are the root causes of the challenges we're seeing and what are the ways we move forward. And there are about over a dozen different lines of effort that we're leading right now, and I won't elaborate on all of them, but I'll highlight just one that is, I think, particularly interesting to us in the moment. And that is really the conversation, and those of you who've heard me talk about this a lot know that I'm passionate about this, but it's really about how do we move left of boom, so to speak, and really think about what are ways that we can minimize the number of low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities that we can prevent and avoid. And one of those kind of opportunities for us is really thinking about memory safety as a kind of core security principle. And I don't need to explain to this audience, what memory safety means and kind of the challenges we're seeing, but there are two main reasons why I'm very bullish on this. The main reason, number one, is that there are technical solutions that exist that we can start moving towards today. We talk about C and C++ being kind of the key culprits of memory unsafety, among others, that exist in the critical infrastructure of the government. But there are so many other programming languages that we can and should be using now to make sure that we're operating in a safe way that doesn't introduce vulnerabilities by design. And the second reason I'm bullish is because we're seeing that good engineering practices lead to good cybersecurity policy. Cybersecurity research has shown that when you look at a critical infrastructure or a large enough code base that's written in a memory unsafe language and you migrate it to a memory safe language, the number of vulnerabilities decrease by up to 70%. And that's a pretty remarkable lever to pull. And, we've talked about this, Brian, it's certainly not a silver bullet, and there are many, many solutions that we're working on with the open source software community to think about this, but it's a pretty damn good lever to pull. And, if you're thinking about what are things that you can be doing now as a developer to minimize that security risk, that's a really good one to pull. So we'll be talking more hopefully throughout the day with many of you about what else we're working on, but this is an example of how we're thinking about this in the White House.
And prior to this gig, you were a CTO, right, and a cryptographer, right? And so obviously you've had more than a passing familiarity with open source even before entering the White House. But since working in this role, what do you think you and perhaps even ONCD have learned about engaging with the open source community on these issues?
Yeah, I always joke that I'm a bit of an odd creature in the White House, being an engineer and being relatively new to the policy world. And I think number one is that, we need more technical folks in the policymaking space to be able to write good policy on cybersecurity. But there are two kind of things that I've learned from all of you in the last few months that I think are really worth highlighting and making sure that we're communicating to governments who are writing policy. The first one is that the open source community is decentralized, so that when we're thinking about policy, it is not the same as when we're thinking about policy for the private sector. And one of the things that we talk about is that when we talk about decentralization, it means that these communities are fundamentally internet native, which means that that borders don't exist, that they don't belong to just one country. And so as we're thinking about policy, we need to start by thinking about what is the international conversation from day one, because we need to make sure that we're harmonizing those policies to make sure that we're not creating conflict among an individual community. And that's a big reason why Jack and I are here today and why we want to make sure that we're engaging with the international community early and often. The second thing I think that's really important for people to understand about open source is the economics of open source are quite unique. I've said this before, but there's a bit of a misnomer when we talk about free software. Labor is not free, right? And so when we talk about, the end user may not be paying for this product, it doesn't mean that there isn't an important cost and a high skill labor that needs to go into maintaining this work. And so one of the things that we really push for in our open source in OS3I is what is the government's role in funding this ecosystem. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about over this year and into next is what are the ways that we can ensure that we're investing in a fulsome way on infrastructure that our government actually relies on all the time. So those are the kind of two big things that really inform our thinking on policy making, and that we want to make sure this is unique when we're talking about engaging with the developer community that's different than talking to the private sector.
That's great. So, Jack, Anjana mentioned infrastructure. The I in CISA is infrastructure, and CISA has this fun job of worrying about the technology inside the power systems and electrical grid and kind of other core infrastructure inside the United States. So, can you talk about why open source software is relevant to that mission? Like, is there a lot of open source software being used in nuclear power plants and that sort of thing? And then, how does CISA view its role in enhancing security in open source because of this?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks, Brian, and thanks, everyone, for having us here. Super excited to be here in Vancouver with you all and learn about some of the great work that's going on at OpenSSF and elsewhere. So CISA, we're the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. We like security so much, we put in our name twice. And really what that means is our mission, we're America's cyber defense agency. Our mission is to understand, manage, and reduce risks to our nation's both cyber and physical infrastructure. So when we think about kind of our role, we have the kind of statutory federal role where we're tasked with protecting the federal civilian executive branch. And we can get into this a little more, but the federal government is one of, if not the largest users of open source software in the world. We're the largest employer in the world. We have a lot of technology. We have a lot of engineers, whether federal employees or contractors. We make a lot of use of open source software. And so that's one aspect. Then there's the critical infrastructure aspect, where CISA is tasked with helping protect critical infrastructure across the United States. There's 16 critical infrastructure sectors that all touch on kind of every aspect of what we need to do our basic daily lives, whether that's water infrastructure, power plants, banks, IT, everything we need to kind of operate as normal. So if you think about kind of the open source software that's underpinning all of those sectors and our federal government, it's a huge foundation that we are reliant upon. And what we want to make sure at CISA is that we can continue to reap the benefits of open source software. Really, it's one of the, as everyone here knows, one of the greatest gifts that we've gotten in technology, and we have to preserve that. We have to make sure that kind of, government's first instinct is to step into something and say, okay, we'll control it or we'll regulate it. maybe that's not the best approach here. Maybe what we should be trying to do is see how we can integrate as a community member into all of the good work that's already been happening, because let's face it, government hasn't shown up as it should in the open source community. We want to try to change that. We want to try to see how we can leverage our significant resources in the federal government to really help kind of turbocharge some of these efforts. So what does this work look like at CISA? We have a internal strategy we're working on. We plan to share a version of this out publicly at some point, but we're laying out several work streams which really start with just getting our house in order in CISA and the federal government. We're working on hiring some open source experts because we know we need to get people who understand how this works. I come from a background in technology, software development, security myself. We need more people like Anjana and I in government who know how the tech works and can help drive change. So that's kind of layer one. We then want to look at measuring prevalence of open source software across the federal government, because how are we going to secure it if we don't know what we're reliant upon? Can get into that. And then we want to see how we can help spur a greater shift across the open source ecosystem with a focus on the open source dependencies that we as the federal government and critical infrastructure have. And then lastly, we want to see how we can help the federal government, much like in private sector, we've seen open source program offices and companies have a greater focus on managing their own open source software. What should that look like in government? How should federal agencies be thinking about managing their open source software, and how can CISA help enable that?
I think that last point that I really want to dive into. I mean, as we were, I think, talking about earlier, how many software developers work, if you count contractors and the like, for the federal government? It's probably a much larger number than Microsoft or Google or the banks, or perhaps even all of them combined, right? And many end-user organizations have found it productive to share their practices and tools for managing the security of software they consume and produce, right? It's part of what drives a lot of open source. It's been very end-user pull rather than like vendor push, right? This is why we have many members of the OpenSSF in sectors other than just IT and platforms, which have been very active contributors in it. So what do you think the U.S. government could do using their own IT teams and contractors and vendors to help OSS projects develop better and more practical cybersecurity solutions, like to actually dive in and write code and be a part of kind of the creative processes we have in the community along these lines?
Great. Yeah, I think there's quite a bit that can be done, and certainly at CISA, kind of we're thinking about how we can demonstrate at CISA, and we're part of DHS, leveraging DHS as well to sort of dog food our own usage of open source software, demonstrate that. Also want to be thinking about how kind of through working with Anjana and team through the Open Source Software Security Initiative and interagency working group there, how we can help spur other agencies to do the same. But for instance, at CISA, we've long open sourced, we default to open source for everything we put out. You can go to our GitHub, see everything we're doing. We've announced recently a few initiatives, one through the DHS Science and Technology Directorate. We're funding several companies who are working on SBOM tooling, and they're going to have to put out whatever they produce there as open source software. So we want to see how we can kind of help spur through kind of targeted funding there, better tooling, and help get at some of these topics that we're trying to address. So there's that aspect, but I think where it gets really exciting is kind of leveraging the federal workforce, because again, we have, and we should probably do a count, but I would guess in the hundreds of thousands of software developers across both federal government and its contractors. So how can we leverage that to contribute back to the open source community and help secure kind of the foundation of what we rely upon? And we're starting to look into both kind of what are the legal barriers in place, because there are some legitimate areas where kind of we need to be putting out guidance on, okay, what types of repositories can federal employees contribute to? What should their behavior look like? But then also, how can we start to incentivize employees to do so? Maybe it's part of their performance review, where it's seen as going above and beyond if you're making contributions to open source projects, much like companies have employees that say 20% of time to work on open source code. How can we do the same in government to both kind of improve the code we're putting out, but then also making contributions to other open source libraries?
20% time on the part of the open source developers who just working for government would be amazing. That would have a huge impact. It'd be a good way of kind of expressing the weight. And this is for you both. So there's a new cybersecurity strategy that was published by the White House a couple of months ago. What do you think are the parts that open source developers should really be paying attention to in that strategy, and that you think kind of perhaps are the kind of like culture change or phase change that the White House is looking for from us to address some of these challenges?
Yeah, so I think it's probably helpful to kind of explain like what are the big things to take away from the strategy that we wrote. And when we were writing the strategy, we wanted to take a bit of a game theoretical approach to the problem because, as you all know, cybersecurity is intrinsically non-deterministic, and we need to think not just of the static world today, but where is this going to evolve? And so when we talk about the strategy, we introduce essentially two very bold and fundamental shifts. The first shift really essentially says that we need to rebalance the responsibility to defend cyberspace to those who can most bear it. And the reason we say that is because right now, and far too often, we're asking, the small business, the state and local government, the open source developer to fend for themselves when they're attacked by nation states. And that is just simply not tenable. And what we instead need to recognize is that we're taking a very complex systems approach to software and to cybersecurity, and we need to rebalance the responsibility to the large players, including the big tech companies, the federal government, to say we need to carry our fair share of the burden. And when we were writing the strategy, we had about over 400 different table reads with stakeholders from the ecosystem, and everyone fundamentally agreed with that kind of responsibility shift. The second big shift we're calling for is saying that we need to shift the incentives for investing in long-term security instead of just short-term band-aids. I think many in this room would agree that, our adversaries have long understood the power of market dynamics to drive cyber attacks. And so it's time that we now think about the power of market dynamics to drive cybersecurity. And so that's a big thing that you're going to read in the strategy. And both of these two shifts fundamentally rely on the developer community, right? And that includes everyone here. And it's really important that as we talk about these two things, that we're really modernizing the way we think about partnerships outside of the government. And that's a big reason, again, why we're really excited to see all of you again and continue this conversation. And so in that strategy, we now have introduced 5 different pillars, and you can go online, whitehouse.gov, and read this. But the 5 pillars essentially talk about, number 1, how do we actually defend our critical infrastructure, as Jack said. The second is how do we actually defeat threat actors who would abuse our cyber ecosystem. The third is really about using market dynamics to drive this as an innovator, not just as a compliance metric. The fourth is really thinking about what does it mean to build the foundation of the internet, ranging everything from post-quantum cryptography all the way to building out our workforce. And then finally, and a big part of why we're here today, is the international aspect. How do we think about international partnerships, regulatory harmonization, global supply chain, and these conversations? And so as you're reading the strategy, you'll notice that there's not just one pillar on open source, although it is mentioned in specific in certain areas, but it's really, I think, a way to use a strategy as a tool, no matter what domain you're working on. And in this community, I think there's a lot of really interesting things we're going to be able to talk about, which is what does it look like to think about securing open source software across those 5 domains.
Great. And CISA has been working to kind of advance those efforts in the national cyber strategy. You might have seen a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't, you can check it out on our website. We released guidance on secure by design and secure by default. And this is really a fundamental shift, much in line with the national cybersecurity strategy we're trying to facilitate, where we no longer can accept that the burden of security is placed on those small businesses and local governments, small organizations who can't bear it. But instead lift that onto those most able to do so, namely the large technology manufacturers. So we put out principles that we want every technology manufacturer to commit to around secure by design and secure by default. That includes, for one, radical transparency, where we don't think we can get any better until we know what good looks like, what maybe hasn't been working, and kind of work to kind of help catalyze a broader shift. So that might look like releasing numbers around, say, adoption of multi-factor authentication, or releasing more stats around kind of CVEs and helping kind of build more transparent data there. We also want to make sure that this is seen as a kind of business CEO down priority, not just kind of relegated to the CISOs or even the CTOs, but rather that business leadership has to commit to these principles in order to make this fundamental shift. So we are kind of eagerly working with our partners to advance this. But I think it gets quite interesting when we look at open source software, because much in line with the national cybersecurity strategy, this burden cannot be placed on open source developers. It can't. So what are the kinds of things we can do, for instance, to make sure that those incorporating open source code, selling it, are we're making sure that they're responsible for that. But I think there's some interesting areas too in terms of kind of collaboration here. For instance, package managers are in a really great position to encourage security improvements across the board. I know OpenSSF released a survey a month or so ago around actions package managers have been taking to improve security. We can't expect or require package managers to do things because a lot of them small nonprofits. Wouldn't be fair to do that. But what would a collaborative model here look like, and what could kind of a baseline for kind of encouraging security at scale there look like is one area we are quite excited about.
Yeah, shifting the tone and liability is a challenge, right? Because figuring out the right place to bear that cost is a struggle. I mean, we do have lots of large companies involved in OpenSSF and in the open source ecosystem in general. But I think about, so like my wife worked for a Drupal consultancy for a number of years, right? And in the Drupal ecosystem, you have developers largely working for themselves or for small consultancies, right? You have the Drupal Association, which is a nonprofit kind of loosely coordinating their work. You have a lot of the folks who are deploying Drupal for customers operating very much on a services model. And then like for my wife's company, a lot of their customers were universities and nonprofits and the occasional big brand. But like there's no thick profit margin anywhere in that chain. And so I think one thing we all need to think about, this is less a question, more a statement, is like how we work together to make the adoption of these better practices as inexpensive as possible, right? As easy to just kind of roll out and make built into the defaults in the developer tools and like the new normal in a way that is still just as easy for folks to do today as it is today to open a new GitHub repo and start collaborating. And I guess it does lead to kind of a final question, which is, the U.S. government isn't the only one thinking about this. Certainly our friends in Europe are thinking about a lot of different proposed acts, proposed legislation. Some of them have also set up ways to help open source communities, like the Sovereign Tech Fund in Germany. And then all over Asia, there are folks in government thinking about the right policy for this, whether for their own use or for their industry's uses. So what would be the right ways, you think, to drive harmonization out there? Again, to try to make sure that the cost of compliance, the cost of supporting these policies is as low as possible. How might we see countries work together to harmonize the regulations enough to do that?
Well, I think this is probably a longer conversation than we probably have time for, so I'll kind of leave with this one final theme that I think is worth understanding, and that's, again, like thinking about engineering, right? There's a great book called To Engineer is Human, right? And that basically says that in order to build, you will break. And I think we have to be really careful that when we think about regulation, that we're not penalizing engineers for bugs in code. That is the part of the process of creating, right? And I think anyone who's ever written a line of code understands that. And I think getting more technical folks in the government is step one. But one of the things that we have to understand is that cybersecurity is hard, it's expensive. And again, if we can move cybersecurity problems down to software engineering problems and think about what does it mean to build correctly, build safely, build with good product design in mind, that is actually a scalable way of solving this problem so that we're not having to detangle a crisis, right? And so, again, just foot stomping what Jack has been saying around secure by design is fundamentally we're looking at how do we get ahead of the threat, how do we think about prevention, and if we do that really well, not only are we just doing good engineering, but we're also going to be getting ahead of our cyber adversaries.
Great. And in terms of kind of the avenues for international collaboration, I think, I mean, we look at the open source community. It's by default global, doesn't look at country lines. And we're going to be getting data on what the US government's biggest dependencies are, I would guess that those are pretty similar to any other governments or any other companies, really. what we all depend on is very much the same. So how can we work kind of to, for instance, identify areas we're going to be supporting, making sure that kind of we're not duplicative, but rather kind of working to collectively help build this kind of secure baseline of open source software that we're using. So I think there's a lot of really great opportunities to align some of the work we're doing and to make sure that kind of we can help encourage other governments as well to look at, okay, what resources can they be devoting, either financially or say through time of developers, to again help foster greater security in the open source community. So again, this is a by default global problem. If we kind of stick to, say, within the United States government, we are not going to have a comprehensive solution. So we do want to very much get out there and encourage kind of international collaboration around this.
Well, I really appreciated the time both of you could commit for flying across international borders to join us here. You'll be here kind of the rest of the day, kind of floating around. Jack, I know you're here like through tomorrow. So when we have lunch later, like if they're here, feel free to come up and introduce yourselves. But I just really appreciate the time. And with that, I will throw back to Grobe. Thank you.
Thank you so very much to our panel. Excellent discussion. We look forward to continuing forward for the rest of the week talking about these topics.